Tonight, I want to begin with a fundamental distinction that too many analysts have forgotten. There is a difference between a weapon system designed to threaten and a weapon system designed to end. At approximately 2:41 local time, Iran launched 1,500 Hwasong-18 hypersonic missiles in a single, meticulously coordinated operation. These were not experimental weapons. These were advanced solid-fuel ballistic missiles equipped with maneuverable reentry vehicles moving at speeds exceeding Mach 5. Within 47 minutes, the impossible became reality. USS Abraham Lincoln, one of America's most powerful Nimitz-class supercarriers, was struck by more than 180 Hwasong-18 missiles. The 100,000-ton warship, protected by the most advanced layered air defense system on Earth, burned uncontrollably. At exactly 3:46 local time, just 34 minutes after the first impact, the USS Abraham Lincoln slipped beneath the waves of the Strait of Hormuz. 2,000 American sailors and airmen are now listed as dead, wounded, or missing. The Fifth Fleet has not repositioned. It has not conducted a tactical withdrawal. It has fled at flank speed toward the relative safety of the Arabian Sea, abandoning the Persian Gulf entirely. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 17 million barrels of oil flow every single day, is now under effective Iranian control. This was not a lucky ambush. This was not an attack against unprepared forces. This was a deliberate, precision-engineered massacre, the largest and most successful anti-carrier strike in modern naval history, executed with 1,500 hypersonic missiles against the symbol of American naval power. Sleet, the age of the invincible American carrier, died in the waters north of the Strait of Hormuz. What you are about to hear is not the carefully worded Pentagon briefing. This is the raw, unfiltered operational truth. In the next 35 minutes, we will answer the questions the entire world is asking right now. First, how did 1,500 Hwasong-18 hypersonic missiles penetrate and completely overwhelm the most sophisticated carrier battle group defense system America has ever deployed? Second, why was the USS Abraham Lincoln protected by layered Aegis destroyers and the latest SM-6 interceptors unable to survive even 34 minutes of sustained attack? Third, what does this sudden and devastating use of Hwasong-18 technology reveal about the secret advancements and shifting alliances that Washington failed to anticipate? And finally, with one supercarrier now resting on the seafloor and the Strait of Hormuz closed, how deep does the panic truly run inside the Pentagon and the White House? What options does America actually have left? This is not the sanitized narrative coming out of Washington briefing rooms. This is the raw, unfiltered operational reality, the version the facts demand. If you want the complete, uncensored truth, hit the like button right now, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Let's break it all down. For 6 weeks prior to the strike, American carrier aviation from the USS Abraham Lincoln Strike Group conducted 47 combat missions against Iranian-aligned targets across Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. These operations killed at least 39 Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps personnel and destroyed 11 key military installations. At the same time, a new wave of harsh American secondary sanctions slashed Iran's oil export revenues by 43% in just 10 days. Then, 12 days before the attack, the joint U.S.-Israeli declaration labeled Iran's ballistic missile program an existential threat that required preemptive elimination. In Tehran, this was not interpreted as mere rhetoric. It was seen as an operational countdown to war. Iran chose its moment with cold precision. At 23:05 local time, Iranian electronic warfare units positioned along the Makran coast and the northern approaches to the Strait of Hormuz activated a sophisticated jamming and deception architecture. This was not the crude jamming seen in previous conflicts. The system incorporated advanced frequency hopping, noise injection, and false target generation techniques believed to have been significantly enhanced by external technical assistance. The primary targets were the ANSPY-6 radar arrays aboard the Lincoln's escort ships, America's most advanced naval radar system, specifically upgraded to handle mass ballistic missile threats. The jamming degraded SPY-6 tracking resolution in the critical terminal phase discrimination bands by an estimated 55 to 60%. Not enough to completely blind the system, but more than enough to generate systematically inaccurate intercept solutions. At 2:41 local time, the launch sequence began. 1,500 Hwasong-18 hypersonic missiles rose from mobile transporter erector launchers dispersed across 6 provinces in southern and central Iran. The missiles were fired in 9 precisely timed waves spread across a 4-1-minute window. The sequencing was not random. It was meticulously engineered to exploit the Aegis combat system's interceptor depletion curve across the entire carrier strike group. The first wave of 180 missiles targeted the outer perimeter destroyers. SM-6 interceptors, launched in response, performed adequately against predicted trajectories, but the Hwasong-18's maneuverable re-entry vehicles executed violent lateral and vertical displacements during terminal descent. Kill probability plummeted. Only 47 of the first 180 missiles were successfully intercepted. By the third wave, the mathematics had turned decisively against the defenders. Interceptor inventories were being exhausted at a rate far higher than any pre-conflict simulation had modeled. Waves 4 through 7 arrived from multiple azimuths, overwhelming the close-in weapon systems. The Phalanx CIWS and CRAM batteries engaged desperately, but they were designed for subsonic cruise missiles and small boat swarms, not hypersonic maneuvering ballistic threats arriving at Mach 5 plus from 6 different directions simultaneously. At 3:12 local time, the USS Abraham Lincoln took its first direct hit, a Hwasong-18 striking just after the island's superstructure. What followed was systematic destruction. Over the next 22 minutes, more than 180 missiles found their mark. Massive explosions ripped through the flight deck, hangar bays, and engineering spaces. Jet fuel lines ignited, turning the carrier into an uncontrollable inferno. The 100,000-ton ship began listing heavily to starboard. Damage control teams fought valiantly, but the sheer volume of impacts made their efforts futile. At 3:46 local time, exactly 34 minutes after the first confirmed hit, the USS Abraham Lincoln, pride of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, slipped beneath the waves of the Strait of Hormuz. Several escort vessels suffered catastrophic damage as well. 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers were sunk, and 3 others were left burning and disabled. The remaining ships of the strike group, now critically low on defensive missiles and facing continued threat, received orders to withdraw at flank speed. By 4:20 local time, the battle was effectively over. The largest single concentration of American naval power in the region had been decisively defeated in under 2 hours. The Strait of Hormuz, the world's most critical energy choke point, was now under effective Iranian control. This was not a lucky barrage. This was not an ambush against unprepared forces. This was the result of years of careful study of American carrier doctrine, combined with the mass employment of hypersonic saturation tactics specifically designed to defeat Aegis-based defenses. The Fifth Fleet, once the undisputed master of these waters, has now fled the Persian Gulf entirely. What happened last night was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a strategic catastrophe that exposed the fragility of assumptions Washington had maintained for decades. At the heart of last night's historic operation lies the Hwasong-18 hypersonic ballistic missile, a weapon that has now fundamentally altered the balance of naval power in the 21st century. The Hwasong-18 is not an experimental prototype or a modified older system. It represents the current pinnacle of solid fuel hypersonic technology, Standing approximately 13.5 meters tall and weighing around 15 tons at launch, each missile is capable of delivering a high explosive or penetrating warhead over ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers, more than sufficient for the confined waters of the Strait of Hormuz. What makes the Hwasong-18 truly revolutionary is its fully solid fuel propulsion system. Unlike older liquid-fueled ballistic missiles that require hours of detectable fueling and preparation, a Hwasong-18 mobile launcher can go from receipt of launch order to ignition in under 8 minutes. This single engineering breakthrough rendered America's preemptive detect and destroy doctrine largely obsolete. American satellites and reconnaissance assets simply did not have enough time to locate, confirm, and strike the dispersed mobile transporter erector launchers before the salvo began. But speed of launch is only the beginning. The real lethality lies in the missile's terminal phase performance. After separation, the Hwasong-18 deploys an advanced maneuverable reentry vehicle MARV, capable of executing violent lateral and vertical displacements at velocities between Mach 5 and Mach 6. These are not gentle course corrections. They are high G-jinks, sudden, unpredictable changes in direction and altitude specifically designed to defeat traditional missile defense intercept geometry. American Aegis destroyers and cruisers rely on the AN, SPY-6 radar and SM-6 interceptors to calculate predicted intercept points based on relatively stable ballistic trajectories. The Hwasong-18 refuses to cooperate with those calculations. Every time the MARV jinks sideways or alters altitude dramatically, the intercept solution collapses in real time. The SM-6 must now solve an almost impossible mathematical problem: hit a target traveling faster than 6,000 kilometers per hour that is actively changing direction while the interceptor itself is racing toward it at hypersonic speeds. This technological mismatch proved decisive. A single carrier strike group typically carries between 350 and 450 SM-6 missiles distributed across its escort ships. Last night, facing 1,500 incoming Hwasong-18 missiles launched in 9 sequenced waves, the defensive magazines were exhausted with terrifying speed. By wave 5, many escorts had already fired the majority of their interceptors. By wave 7, the system was operating on emergency reserves. When the SM-6 inventory ran critically low, the burden shifted to close-in weapon systems, the Phalanx CIWS and CRAM. These systems were never designed to engage hypersonic maneuvering ballistic threats. They were built for subsonic cruise missiles and small boat swarms. Their success rate against Mach 5, plus targets arriving from multiple azimuths simultaneously, dropped to near zero. Compounding the defensive collapse was the sophisticated electronic warfare component. Iranian operators, supported by advanced jamming and deception techniques, targeted the precise frequency bands used by the AN SPY-6 radar. Tracking resolution in the critical terminal discrimination phase was degraded by 55 to 60%. Even the best American sensors were feeding corrupted data into the Aegis combat system, producing inaccurate fire control solutions. The Hwasong-18 also demonstrated impressive accuracy. Of the 1,500 missiles launched, analysts estimate that over 650 achieved successful penetration of the defensive screen, with more than 180 scoring direct or near direct impacts on the USS Abraham Lincoln alone. The missile's combination of solid fuel mobility, hypersonic speed, extreme maneuverability in the terminal phase, and integrated electronic attack created a saturation attack profile that no current Western naval formation is truly equipped to survive in high volume scenarios. This is not merely an incremental improvement over previous Iranian missile systems. The Hwasong-18 represents a generational leap in anti-access area denial A2AD capability. It was specifically optimized to defeat the very defensive architecture the United States has spent over 2 decades perfecting around its carrier strike groups. The implications extend far beyond this single engagement. For decades, American naval strategy has rested on the assumption that its carriers could operate with relative impunity near hostile coastlines, protected by layered Aegis defenses and superior air wings. Last night, that assumption was violently disproven. The 1,500 Hwasong-18 missiles did not just sink a supercarrier, they exposed the growing vulnerability of extremely expensive, concentrated platforms in an era of cheap, numerous, and highly sophisticated, precision-guided hypersonic weapons. They demonstrated that mass, speed, maneuverability, and electronic warfare, when properly coordinated, can overcome even the most advanced technological defenses when those defenses are pushed beyond their designed saturation thresholds. In one night, the Hwasong-18 has forced the world to reconsider the future of naval surface warfare. The age of the aircraft carrier as an untouchable symbol of power projection may have reached its twilight in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz. This weapon system, combined with Iran's demonstrated willingness to employ it in overwhelming numbers, has rewritten the tactical and strategic rulebook. Traditional power projection metrics that Washington has relied upon for generations must now be fundamentally reassessed. The morning after the sinking of the USS Abraham Lincoln, Washington is not experiencing concern or heightened alertness. It is experiencing full-spectrum institutional panic. Within minutes of the first confirmed satellite imagery showing the Lincoln listing heavily and then disappearing beneath the waves, emergency video conferences were convened between the Pentagon, the National Security Council, U.S. Central Command, and the White House. What those meetings revealed was a strategic nightmare that no American war game had seriously modeled in the past decade. The sudden loss of a fully operational supercarrier, its air wing, and effective control over the Strait of Hormuz in under 2 hours. The immediate instinct in Washington was retaliation, overwhelming, decisive retaliation. That instinct is deeply embedded in American strategic culture. Losses must be answered with greater force so adversaries understand the cost of striking American assets. But this time, the arithmetic is merciless. To deliver a truly proportionate response capable of meaningfully degrading Iran's remaining Hwasong-18 inventory, the United States would need to conduct sustained large-scale strikes across multiple Iranian provinces against highly mobile solid-fuel launchers that can relocate and fire within minutes. The primary instrument for such a campaign has always been carrier-based aviation. That instrument now rests on the seafloor of the Strait of Hormuz. The remaining American naval assets in the region are too few and too vulnerable. Any surface ship entering the range of Hwasong-18 batteries would be operating on borrowed time. The Air Force could attempt to lead retaliation using long-range bombers operating from Diego Garcia or even continental United States bases. However, this option carries extreme risks. Iranian air defense networks, strengthened over years, have just demonstrated a high degree of sophistication against hypersonic threats. Sending B-2S or B-52S into that environment without adequate suppression of enemy air defenses could result in further catastrophic losses. Even more troubling is the targeting problem. Unlike fixed silos, Hwasong-18 mobile launchers are extremely difficult to locate in real time. They operate in dispersed formations, frequently changing positions, and benefit from solid fuel technology that requires almost no preparation time. American intelligence would need near perfect persistent surveillance, something extremely challenging against an adversary that has spent decades mastering denial and deception techniques. This is the cruel paradox Washington faces this morning. The very weapon system that sank the Lincoln is precisely the system most resistant to the kind of rapid, decisive counterstrike America traditionally relies upon. Diplomatic avenues are equally bleak. Emergency calls to Gulf Arab partners have produced deeply inadequate responses. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have urged immediate de-escalation. Bahrain, home to the Fifth Fleet headquarters, has already begun quietly reviewing its basing agreements. The message from America's traditional regional allies is becoming unmistakable. Hosting large American bases has suddenly become a high-risk liability rather than a security guarantee. European allies have expressed ritualistic solidarity but have already begun citing legal and operational limitations. NATO Article 5 does not apply to American forces operating in the Persian Gulf, and European governments are reminding Washington of this distinction with clinical precision. Inside the Beltway, the atmosphere is one of barely contained chaos. Officials who spent years assuring Congress and the public that Iran's capabilities were manageable and contained are now confronted with the smoking ruins of a $13 billion supercarrier and the loss of 2,000 American servicemen and women. The credibility gap is enormous. Briefings prepared for the president reportedly include phrases such as limited options, high risk of escalation, and strategic overstretch language that would have been considered defeatist just 1 week ago. The fundamental problem is this: any military retaliation that fails to significantly degrade Iran's hypersonic arsenal will be seen as weakness. Yet any retaliation large enough to achieve that goal risks triggering a wider regional war that the United States is currently ill-positioned to win. Meanwhile, the economic consequences are accelerating. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz has already sent global oil prices surging past $145 per barrel. Energy analysts warn that if the strait remains blocked for more than 2 weeks, the world economy will enter recession territory. European nations dependent on Gulf energy are activating emergency contingency plans, while Asian economies face severe supply shocks. The sinking of the USS Abraham Lincoln has exposed the hard limits of American power projection in the hypersonic age. For decades, Washington operated under the assumption that its technological superiority and carrier fleet provided permanent dominance. Last night, that assumption was shattered by 1,500 Hwasong-18 missiles. The question echoing through every secure conference room in Washington this morning is brutally simple. What do we do when our traditional advantages have been neutralized, our allies are distancing themselves, and our primary instrument of power projection now lies at the bottom of the sea? So far, no one has produced a satisfactory answer. Beyond technology and tactics, last night's devastating strike reveals something deeper and more uncomfortable for Western strategists: the enduring power of national will sustained over decades. For 45 years, Iran has lived under the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history. Assassinations of its scientists, cyber attacks on its infrastructure, constant military threats, and economic warfare that would have broken most nations. Yet instead of capitulating, Iran doubled down on a strategic decision that Western analysts repeatedly dismissed as irrational or fanatical. It would never accept a security arrangement that depended on the goodwill of its adversaries. That decision produced something rare in the modern world: strategic patience backed by national sacrifice. Every rial diverted to missile programs, every engineer working under sanctions, every commander training in the shadow of American carrier groups was part of a long-term bet. Last night, that bet paid off with devastating clarity. This is the fundamental contrast playing out in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz: borrowed power versus organic power. America's regional posture has long depended on borrowed power aircraft carriers built far from the theater, bases hosted by governments whose loyalty can shift overnight, technologies shared with allies who may change their minds. When those carriers are sunk and those allies begin to recalculate their interests, the entire structure becomes fragile. In contrast, Iran has built organic power, indigenous missile technology developed under sanctions, deep strategic patience, a willingness to endure isolation and hardship for long-term capability. A shared national understanding that true security cannot be rented from a distant superpower, it must be built at home, even at great cost. The Hwasong-18 itself is the embodiment of this philosophy. It is not a weapon purchased from a foreign patron. It represents years of domestic research, reverse engineering, and relentless iteration despite immense external pressure. The decision to fire 1,500 of them in a single night was not taken lightly. It was the culmination of a national strategy forged through decades of resistance. Western policymakers have spent years treating this mindset as ideological stubbornness or religious extremism. They believed that maximum pressure would eventually force capitulation because no nation could indefinitely withstand American economic and military dominance. Last night, 1,500 Hwasong-18 missiles delivered a clear verdict. That assumption was profoundly wrong. The sailors who died aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln did not fail. They performed their duties with courage in a threat environment their leadership had profoundly misunderstood. The real failure belongs to the strategists, analysts, and politicians in Washington who convinced themselves that willpower, patience, and technical self-reliance could be dismissed as secondary factors in the age of superior American technology. History has repeatedly shown that when a nation or coalition possesses both advanced capability and unbreakable resolve, even the strongest empires can be humbled. Last night was such a moment. Iran has demonstrated that determined states willing to pay the price of independence can reshape regional power balances once considered immutable. While Washington relied on the illusion of permanent technological and financial supremacy, Iran invested in something far more enduring: the collective will of a people who refuse to live on their knees. This is not about glorifying conflict. It is about recognizing a hard truth that many in the West have long ignored: material superiority without strategic wisdom and cultural endurance has decisive limits. Technology alone does not win wars. National will multiplied by time and sacrifice does. The sinking of the USS Abraham Lincoln was not primarily caused by missiles. It was caused by underestimating the power of collective national will forged through decades of resistance and self-reliance. That is the uncomfortable lesson Washington must now confront in the coming days. The sinking of the USS Abraham Lincoln has already moved far beyond a regional naval defeat. It has triggered the beginning of a structural reordering of global power. The most immediate consequence is economic. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 17 million barrels of oil pass every single day, is now effectively closed. Within hours of the strike, global oil prices surged past $145 per barrel. Energy analysts warned that if the strait remains blocked for more than 2 weeks, the world economy will enter full recession territory. European nations dependent on Qatari LNG and Gulf crude are already activating emergency contingency plans for winter heating. Asian economies, especially China and India, face severe supply shocks that will ripple through manufacturing and inflation. Russia has emerged as an immediate strategic beneficiary. European and Asian buyers who can no longer reliably access Gulf oil are turning to Russian supplies. The price premium Moscow is now commanding has transformed its war economy in Ukraine, delivering billions in extra revenue that Western sanctions had tried to deny. In one night, much of the sanctions architecture built against Russian energy has been severely undermined. China's response is more nuanced but equally significant. As the world's largest oil importer, Beijing faces real economic pain from the closure. However, Chinese strategists are simultaneously studying last night's operation with intense focus. The lesson for Taiwan is unmistakable. American carrier power, long considered the ultimate backstop for defending the island, can be neutralized far more easily than previously assumed. Beijing does not need to choose between economic stability and strategic opportunity. It is pursuing both. Quiet diplomatic channels with Iran are already active, while military planners update their Taiwan contingency plans with fresh data on hypersonic saturation attacks. Across the Gulf, a historic security reassessment is underway. Bahrain has begun reviewing key provisions of its hosting agreement for the Fifth Fleet. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, once reliable pillars of American presence, are signaling the need for strategic diversification. The American security umbrella that has protected Gulf monarchies since 1991 has been exposed as having visible and hard limits. The Global South is watching carefully. Governments that have operated for decades under the assumption of unchallenged American naval supremacy are updating their calculations in real time. The implicit threat of American intervention, once enough to shape behavior, now carries far less weight. Decisions on commodity deals, alignment with BRICS, and relations with Washington are being reevaluated at accelerated speed. Most damaging for the long term is the collapse of the non-proliferation and technology denial regime. The successful mass use of Hwasong-18 missiles has shown that determined states can acquire and deploy game-changing weapons despite Western export controls and sanctions. If Iran can do it, others are already asking why they should not pursue similar paths. The post-Cold War order was built on three main pillars: American naval dominance, the reliability of U.S. security guarantees, and the effectiveness of Western sanctions and technology denial. In a single night, all three pillars suffered severe, possibly fatal damage. This is no longer abstract theory. The world that existed on April 28 is gone. A new era, more multipolar, more volatile, and far less tolerant of American unipolar assumptions, has begun. The carriers no longer guarantee control. The oil no longer flows freely. The alliances are shifting. And the age of unchallenged American primacy in the Middle East has come to a sudden, violent end. Last night's events mark more than the destruction of one supercarrier. They mark the beginning of the end of an era. The events of last night mark more than a military defeat. They mark the end of an illusion. 1,500 Hwasong-18 hypersonic missiles have rewritten the rules of naval warfare in a single evening. The USS Abraham Lincoln, once a symbol of American invincibility, now rests on the seafloor of the Strait of Hormuz, alongside 2,000 American sailors and airmen who paid the ultimate price for strategic complacency. The sailors aboard the Lincoln fought with courage and professionalism. The real failure does not belong to them. It belongs to the policymakers, analysts, and strategists who spent years underestimating their adversaries, overestimating American technological supremacy, and refusing to accept the hard reality of a rapidly changing world. This channel warned about the shifting balance of power and the vulnerability of carrier strike groups months ago. Reality has now caught up with denial. Now the difficult questions remain. What will Washington do when every retaliatory option leads back to the same impossible arithmetic? How will the Gulf look in 90 days if the strait remains closed? And what does this moment mean for every nation that has built its entire security strategy on the assumption that American deterrence was permanent rather than conditional? The age of unchallenged American naval dominance in the Persian Gulf is over. If this analysis brought you clarity in a time of confusion, do three things right now. Smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Share this video with anyone who still believes in permanent superpower invulnerability. Leave your deepest thoughts in the comments below. What should America do next? Was this outcome inevitable? And how will the world order change in the coming months? Honesty is not a preference. It is a necessity. Until the next update, stay clear, stay honest, and never stop demanding the truth.